They call it the system that broke itself. Inside Alabama's prisons, men live shoulder to shoulder in heat over 100 degrees, armed, desperate, forgotten. Guards fear to enter. Inmates film murders on smuggled phones. The federal government calls it a human rights crisis. The state calls it under control. But behind the steel doors and the silence lies a truth more terrifying than fiction. This isn't just a prison problem, it's a system that collapsed from the inside. Welcome to Alabama's deadliest prisons. The collapse of control. It starts with a number. 20,000. That's roughly how many people are currently imprisoned inside Alabama's correctional system. A system built to hold just 9,000. Overcrowded. Understaffed. Explosive. That's not just a description, it's a diagnosis. For decades, Alabama's prisons have been boiling over, a slow-motion disaster ignored until it became impossible to hide. The Department of Justice calls them among the most violent in the nation. Federal judges have called them unconstitutional. And yet, year after year, the headlines remain the same. Inmate found dead. Another riot at St. Clair. Officer attacked at Donaldson. Inside these walls, law and order no longer belong to the state. They belong to the gangs. At Donaldson Correctional Facility, one of the state's largest and most dangerous prisons, inmates refer to the compound as the House of Pain. Built in the 1980s, it was designed to house Alabama's most violent offenders, men who'd already committed murders, assaults, and escapes in other facilities. But now, it's home to thousands of men serving time for everything from robbery to drug possession. When the system ran out of space, they sent everyone to Donaldson, and when the guards quit, they just stopped trying to control it. Former officers describe entire cell blocks left unattended for hours at a time. Inmates run stores out of their cells, selling drugs, cigarettes, and contraband phones. And when debts aren't paid, blood spills. In 2022 alone, 266 people died in Alabama's prisons, the highest death toll in the system's history. Many were ruled natural causes. But survivors say otherwise. Inmate letters smuggled to the outside tell stories of stabbings, overdoses, and suicides, sometimes discovered days later. One wrote, "You can smell the blood before you see it. They say it's normal now." At St. Clair Correctional Facility, a 2019 video went viral showing a man being stabbed repeatedly as others cheered. It wasn't a riot, it was everyday life. How does a prison system collapse like this? To understand that, you have to look at three things: the numbers, the neglect, and the corruption. The numbers. Alabama's incarceration rate is one of the highest in the nation. Over 900 inmates per 100,000 residents. That means Alabama locks up more people per capita than most countries on Earth. Why? Because for decades, politicians built careers on being tough on crime. They passed mandatory minimums, restricted parole, and filled the prisons faster than they could build them. Rehabilitation disappeared. Punishment became policy. The neglect. By 2017, a federal investigation revealed rampant sexual assault, drug trafficking, and daily violence across Alabama's prisons. Inmates lived without proper medical care, often going weeks without seeing a nurse. Some facilities ran out of soap, toilet paper, and clean water. Cells meant for 2 men now hold 4 or 5. There are no programs, no jobs, no safety, just endless time. A former correctional officer, speaking to AL.com, said, "We're not guarding inmates anymore. We're babysitting chaos." The corruption. When systems break, corruption fills the cracks. Smuggled drugs, contraband phones, and bribed staff became the new economy inside Alabama's prisons. Cell phones are currency. Knives are common. One inmate described guards who bring in drugs for extra cash. Everybody's hustling, inmates and officers alike. The only difference is who gets caught. The result is a prison system that no longer functions as a system. It's not rehabilitation. It's not containment. It's survival. Even the federal government stepped in. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice sued the state of Alabama, accusing it of failing to protect prisoners from violence and sexual abuse, and failing to provide safe conditions of confinement. The lawsuit reads like a horror script. Men stabbed to death in overcrowded dorms. Victims of sexual assault left untreated. Prisoners beaten while guards looked away. One investigator summarized it best. It's not a prison system. It's a battlefield. By the time the sun sets over the Alabama hills, the air above Donaldson, St. Clair, and Holman prisons hums with tension. The fences shimmer in the heat. And behind those fences, the state's most dangerous and most desperate men prepare for another night where survival is never guaranteed. But Alabama's prisons didn't become this deadly overnight. The chaos we see today is built on decades of history, of racism, slavery, and neglect, stretching back more than 150 years. To truly understand how the system broke down, we have to go back to where it all began. The birth of Alabama's prison industry, forged in the ashes of the Civil War and built on the bodies of the enslaved. From slavery to steel bars, the origins of Alabama's broken prison system. To understand why Alabama's prisons are collapsing today, you have to understand why they were built in the first place. Because the truth is brutal, Alabama's prisons were never designed to rehabilitate anyone. They were designed to replace slavery. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South faced a crisis unlike anything in its history. Its economy was shattered. Its plantations were empty. And its enslaved labor force, the foundation of everything, was suddenly free. But freedom, as the 13th Amendment made clear, came with a catch. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist within the United States. That one phrase, except as punishment for a crime, became the legal loophole that allowed slavery to live on in another form. And no state exploited that loophole more aggressively than Alabama. The birth of the convict leasing system. In the 1870s, Alabama lawmakers faced a problem. Thousands of newly freed black men, and a desperate need for labor to rebuild the state's economy. So they found a solution: arrest them. Local sheriffs began rounding up freedmen for petty crimes. Vagrancy, loitering, talking too loud, not having proof of employment. The charges didn't matter. What mattered was the conviction, because once convicted, the state could legally lease them out to private companies, plantations, and industrialists. It was called convict leasing. Men were sent to work in coal mines, railroads, and timber camps, not for days or weeks, but for years. The state made money from everybody at least. Private companies paid the government for cheap, disposable labor, and the government paid nothing for their care. If a prisoner died, they simply replaced him with another. Between 1875 and 1900, over 90% of Alabama's leased convicts were black. And the death rates were staggering. At the Pratt Mines near Birmingham, 40% of prisoners died every year from exhaustion, starvation, or abuse. A journalist who visited one site in 1883 described men, covered in sores, chained together, and half naked, forced to work 16 hours a day underground. The system was so profitable that by the 1890s, over one-third of Alabama's entire state budget came from convict leasing. It was slavery, legalized, industrialized, and hidden behind the word justice. The state's darkest secret. For decades, Alabama's leaders defended the system. They claimed it was efficient. They called it reform. But survivors and witnesses told a different story, of whippings, torture, and death. In 1922, a reporter from the Birmingham Age-Herald wrote, "The least convicts of Alabama are the most abused labor force in America. Their cries are unheard. Their deaths uncounted." One survivor later testified that guards beat men with iron bars until they couldn't walk. Another recalled being chained to his bed for weeks for trying to rest during a shift. By 1928, public outrage forced Alabama to officially end convict leasing. But it didn't end exploitation, it just changed its name. From leasing to prison farms. After convict leasing was abolished, the state built sprawling prison farms, enormous facilities where inmates were forced to grow cotton, raise livestock, and perform manual labor. The most infamous of these was Atmore Prison Farm, later known as Holman Correctional Facility, the same Holman that, a century later, would become one of America's most violent prisons. At Atmore, inmates worked under armed guards on horseback. The heat was unbearable. Beatings were common. And while the official purpose was correction through labor, the reality was financial. The state used inmate labor to save money and make profit. Even the architecture reflected control. The farms were laid out like plantations, long rows of fields, watchtowers instead of overseers, fences instead of chains. It wasn't a reform system, it was a rebranded plantation. By the 1950s, Alabama had one of the largest inmate labor systems in the South. And while other states began investing in education or rehabilitation, Alabama doubled down on punishment. The result was a culture, one that believed inmates weren't human beings to reform, but resources to manage. The new chain gang. In the 1990s, Alabama revived one of its darkest traditions, the chain gang. Under Governor Fob James, prisoners were once again shackled together and forced to perform roadside labor, under the scorching Alabama sun, watched by guards with shotguns. The image was shocking, a living echo of the 1800s. Civil rights groups condemned it, calling it public humiliation as punishment. But to Alabama politicians, it played well with voters. Being tough on crime was popular, and cruelty was rebranded as strength. Though the practice officially ended in 1995, the mentality behind it never left. Prisoners were, and still are, treated as property, not people. And that mentality is exactly what led to the crisis we see today. The legacy that never died. By the 21st century, Alabama's prison population exploded. Harsh sentencing laws and limited parole created an endless pipeline of inmates, many serving long sentences for nonviolent crimes. Meanwhile, budgets shrank. Guards quit. Facilities decayed. The old cycle, exploitation, neglect, death, returned in full force. The modern Alabama prison system is the child of the 19th century. Its DNA is slavery. Its foundation is profit. Its symptom is violence. When the Department of Justice investigated Alabama's prisons in 2019, they found echoes of convict leasing everywhere. Overcrowded dorms, unpaid labor, physical abuse, racial inequality, and a state that still benefits from keeping people locked away. One investigator said it plainly. You can trace a straight line from the slave camps of the 1800s to the cell blocks of today. That's not an opinion, that's history. A history written in blood, concrete, and the quiet screams of men buried by a system that was never meant to save them. But if the past explains how it began, the present explains how it became unstoppable. Because today, Alabama's prisons aren't just haunted by history, they're being torn apart by violence, drugs, and chaos that even the government can't control. Blood in the cell blocks, inside Alabama's deadliest prisons. If hell exists on earth, you'll find it behind the gates of Donaldson, St. Clair, and Holman, three prisons that have become symbols of chaos, fear, and death. Each was built to hold Alabama's worst of the worst. But over time, they've turned into something even darker, warehouses of desperation, where violence isn't a threat, it's a routine. Donaldson Correctional Facility, the House of Pain. Let's start with Donaldson, west of Birmingham, a name that echoes like a curse in Alabama's prison system. Built in 1982 to hold 1,000 inmates, it now crams in nearly 2,400. That means men sleep 3 to a cell, on floors, or inside bathrooms. The air reeks of sweat, mold, and rot. Temperatures soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Guards are scarce. Some nights, only 5 or 6 officers patrol a compound of over 2,000 men. Even the officers admit it, we don't control Donaldson anymore. Inmates rule the dorms through violence and fear. There's no real system, only power. If you can fight, you survive. If you can pay, you buy protection. If you can't do either, you're prey. One former inmate described it bluntly. You don't walk into Donaldson. You get thrown into it and hope you come out alive. Gangs control everything. Food, drugs, even access to toilets. Debts are settled in blood. And in the shadows, cell phones record what the state tries to deny. Videos of stabbings, beatings, and bodies lying motionless on the floor. In 2022, a leaked video from Donaldson showed inmates dragging a man through a dorm, covered in blood. He was still breathing when they filmed him. By the time the footage surfaced online, he was dead. No officer intervened. None even appeared in the video. Because by the time the screams echoed down the hall, there was no one left to hear them. St. Clair Correctional Facility, Murder Mountain. About an hour north, St. Clair sits tucked behind dense woods near the small town of Springville. Locals call it Murder Mountain. The nickname isn't an exaggeration. Between 2015 and 2022, at least 28 inmates were killed inside its walls, many stabbed or beaten to death. The Justice Department described St. Clair as an environment of pervasive violence. Even correctional officers say it's the worst post in the state. One former guard, speaking anonymously, said, "You walk in every day knowing you might not walk out. Not because of the inmates, but because the system left you to die in there." In 2019, footage surfaced of a man being stabbed repeatedly in broad daylight. Other inmates stood around watching, some filming, some cheering. The attack lasted nearly 5 minutes before anyone arrived. By then, it was too late. His name was Kenneth, a 32-year-old serving time for burglary. He wasn't a gang member. He wasn't violent. He had 2 years left on his sentence. He died on the concrete floor of a dorm room, a casualty of a system that gave up on him long before that day. And Kenneth's story isn't unique. Inside St. Clair, suicide rates have tripled. Overdose deaths doubled. Every month brings another headline. Inmate found dead. Violence prompts lockdown. Officer injured in assault. To Alabama officials, it's statistics. To the men inside, it's reality. Holman Correctional Facility, the slaughterhouse. Then there's Holman, Alabama's most infamous prison. Home to death row and the state's execution chamber. It's where condemned men await the end, and where many others meet it early. Built in 1969, Holman was meant for 500 inmates. Today it holds nearly double that. The walls are cracked, the ventilation broken, and the roof leaks when it rains. The facility has been so overrun with violence that even correctional officers call it the slaughterhouse. In 2020, during a riot, inmates set fires, took over dorms, and posted live videos from inside. They showed knives, drugs, and chaos, a prison fully under inmate control. When the smoke cleared, several were dead, dozens injured, and the warden himself resigned. One inmate wrote afterward, "Holman ain't a prison anymore. It's a graveyard that forgot how to stop burying people." Executions at Holman have also drawn global attention. Alabama has been criticized for botched lethal injections, where prisoners suffered for hours as officials struggled to find veins. Even death, it seems, is mishandled here. And yet, despite federal investigations, lawsuits, and media outrage, little changes. Because Alabama's prison crisis isn't just about broken buildings or violent men. It's about a broken system, one that values punishment over humanity, profit over rehabilitation, and silence over accountability. The cycle of silence. When someone dies inside, the story is almost always the same. A press release, a brief investigation, and no answers. Families receive phone calls saying only, "He passed away." No explanation. No justice. A mother from Mobile, whose son was killed inside St. Clair, said through tears, "They told me he died from natural causes. But my baby's skull was crushed. What's natural about that?" Another woman said she learned about her brother's death through Facebook, after inmates posted about it online before the prison even notified her. For many families, Alabama's prisons are black holes, places where loved ones vanish, sometimes forever. A system beyond saving. The state claims reform is coming. They've promised new prisons, better staff training, and tighter oversight. But critics argue these are just band-aids on bullet wounds. Money is poured into concrete, not care. More walls, more cells, more silence. As one prison advocate said, "You can build new buildings, but if the same mindset runs them, you'll get the same death count." And she's right. Because Alabama's prison system doesn't need bigger walls, it needs a soul. The system that broke down. The camera pans over the Alabama countryside, fields of red clay stretching toward a burning horizon. The fences glint under the setting sun. Sirens wail faintly in the distance. A narrator speaks softly. Once, prisons were meant to correct. Now, they only contain. In Alabama, control is an illusion, traded for profit, lost to violence. The system didn't fail. It functioned exactly as it was built to. Inside the cells, the night falls. The lights flicker out. Somewhere, a man whispers a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for tomorrow. Outside, life goes on. Politicians debate. Families grieve. And Alabama's deadliest prisons remain what they've always been, a reflection of everything America doesn't want to see. Fade to black. Title card, Inside Alabama's Deadliest Prisons, the System That Broke Down. Runtime, 23:40.